was a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Though it never did come to actual war thus cold, it had a few close calls. The war began when the United States and Great Britain, who had previously won World War II, grew suspicious of the USSR, which now controlled much of Eastern Europe. One of the aforementioned close calls was the Cuban Revolution, where the Soviet Union allied itself with Fidel Castro, the new president of Cuba. This went to put the US over a hot flame as if in a boiling pot. With the communist regime of Castro south of the US and the threat of the USSR to the west, the US was stuck between two possible nuclear annihilations. During the Cold War, John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, took 1,500 Cuban exiles and trained them to overthrow Castro's reign. In 3 days, Cuba's military had humiliated the US and crushed the CIA-trained Cuban exiles. This was one of the closest calls of the Cold War, with it serving to bolster the Cuban military's public image and weaken the US's.
Crisis arose as a 13-day-long conflict in 1962, occurring on the 16th and 20th of October. The standoff took place during the Cold War, which had been declared in January of 1947. Although tension had already arisen when John F. Kennedy, President of the United States, had tried to invade Cuba in the humiliating Bay of Pigs incident. This in part led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which transpired in Cuba, located in the Caribbean Sea. The United States, Cuba, and the Soviet Union were all involved in the debate along with their respective allies. Once President Kennedy found out about the missiles, he met with a team of advisors and decided to surround Cuba in a naval blockade. Over the course of 13 days, Soviet Premier Khrushchev and President Kennedy debated over whether the missiles should be dismantled and removed or should stay stationed in Cuba. On October 28th, Nikita Khrushchev sent a letter to John F. Kennedy agreeing to dismantle the missiles in Cuba if Kennedy removed his missiles from Turkey and promised to never again invade Cuba. This led to a suspension of post-Cold War conflicts between Russia and the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major success of diplomacy, diffusing some of the tension between Russia and the United States. It also established the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which was signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, serving to set a limit on nuclear tests throughout those countries.
Sunday, October the 28th, 1962, was the day the world stepped back from the brink of nuclear war. Soviet nuclear missiles were on their way to Cuba. President Kennedy was determined they wouldn't get there.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
As the world held its breath, the two navies drew closer together. What would the Soviets do? After all, there was much pride at stake. Cuba's Fidel Castro was one of Moscow's most ardent supporters. Mr. Khrushchev had been at pains to nurture him as an ally whose country was less than 100 miles from the American mainland. Castro, for his part, was receiving massive Soviet aid. His people relied on it. He had to go along with what Moscow wanted, whether he liked it or not. To prove that he wasn't bluffing, President Kennedy ordered home the families of servicemen serving on the American naval base on Cuba. Several secret exchanges now took place between Washington and Moscow to try to find a way out of the situation that would save everyone's face. It wasn't easy, and the world watched this game of nuclear poker. The president kept up the pressure by sending in the Marines to reinforce the American base at Guantanamo. In the end, it was Mr. Khrushchev who backed down, ordering his ships to head out of the Caribbean. In return, President Kennedy promised the United States wouldn't invade Cuba.
Lasting impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the isolation of Cuba. Even before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba had been suspended from the Organization of American States, a cooperation between the American states. Cuba had mainly been suspended because of its principles and objectives. Though this still continues into the present day, it was most prevalent during the times directly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was caused by the world's mistrust of Cuba after they had been shown to be nothing but the USSR's lapdog during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The isolation of Cuba caused a recession in the Cuban economy, which is shown by the fact in 1959, the year Castro took power, Cuba's global domestic product per capita was $2,067 a year. And over the 60-year U.S. embargo that followed the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba lost an estimated $130 billion. This staggering lost revenue shows how the U.S. isolated Cuba from its biggest trade partner, showing a deep distrust that still continues to this day. Some people might say that the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't a success of diplomacy. Those who might say that say Khrushchev only reached out to the U.S. when they were about to decide when to invade Cuba, showing not diplomacy, but strain under pressure. Or maybe they would cite the fact that an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba during the crisis. These pieces of evidence do support the claim that the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't a success of diplomacy, but there is far more evidence supporting the fact that it was a highly successful compromise between the U.S. and the USSR, along with preventing any conflict with Cuba until the present day.
The Limited Test Ban Treaty was established by the U.S. and the Soviet Union in 1963, the 25th of July and the 5th of August. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy gave a speech to the U.S. citizens about their current situation, saying, "We have in the past made strenuous efforts to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. We have proposed the elimination of all arms and military bases and a fair and effective disarmament treaty." In this text, President Kennedy explains that in the past, the United States have made efforts to stop the growth of nuclear weapons. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum states the intent of the treaty, and in the document, there is a specific section called Lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis, meaning that the treaty was established because of those events. In the section, it states, as Khrushchev described it, the two most powerful nations have been squared off against each other, each with its finger on the button. JFK shared this concern, once remarking at a White House meeting, "It is insane that two men sitting on opposite sides of the world should be able to bring an end to civilization." In a series of private letters, Khrushchev and Kennedy reopened the dialogue of banning nuclear testing. The leaders of the U.S. and the USSR both agreed that a treaty should be created to prevent future situations like the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis, while being a success of diplomacy, could have ended in war. The events citizens had to face were Kennedy and Khrushchev. This led them to make the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, preventing nuclear weapon testing around the world.
Throughout this documentary, we've informed you that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a major success of diplomacy. The crisis lasted 13 days and finally concluded after many negotiations between President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The Cuban Missile Crisis resulted in Cuba's isolation due to the fact that Cuba had been seen as the USSR's lapdog, providing a missile base that could reach far into the continental U.S. A year after the disagreement, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev decided to create the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963. Taking 12 days, the treaty had been signed by the United States of America, Soviet Union, and Great Britain, serving to prevent nuclear tests in the atmosphere, space, and underwater. When Kennedy and Khrushchev came to an agreement during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it showed diplomacy between two nuclear powerhouses.
This government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail. The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States.